In our world of instant judgments and surface-level opinions, we often forget that true worth hides where we least expect to find it. This tale from the 1880s frontier reminds us that dignity and character matter more than appearances, a lesson our modern society desperately needs to remember. The silence stretched taut as piano wire. Ruth Caldwell's heart hammered against her ribs as every eye in Timber Creek's town square fixed on the mountain man's weathered face. The smell of autumn leaves and wood smoke hung heavy in the crisp morning air. Elias Morgan stood motionless, his gray-green gaze moving slowly down the line of unmarried women displayed like prize heifers at auction. Mary Adelaide Morrison fluffed her golden curls and thrust her chest forward. The widow Patterson smoothed her black silk dress with trembling fingers. Even plain Sarah Mills attempted a coquettish smile. But Elias's worn leather boots stopped directly in front of Ruth. She hunched deeper into her patched brown calico, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. The scent of fresh bread from the bakery across the square couldn't mask her shame. The word hit the square like thunder. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Ruth's mother pressed a flour sack into her trembling hands. The rough burlap scratched against her palms like sandpaper. "Your things! Pack quick before folks start gawking worse than they already are." Ruth stuffed her spare dress, the blue one, with carefully darned sleeves, into the sack's bottom. Her mother's cracked leather Bible followed, its yellowed pages releasing the faint scent of lavender sachets. The small sewing kit clinked as metal thimbles knocked together. Neighbors clustered on their wooden porches, voices drifting across the dusty street in urgent whispers. Ruth caught fragments through the crisp air. That fat girl. "Mountain man's gone mad. Won't last the winter up there." Elias waited beside two horses, their breath visible in white puffs against the morning chill. His weathered hands adjusted leather reins with the easy confidence of a man who'd handled animals his entire life. "You ever been on a horse?" His voice carried no mockery, only practical concern. Ruth shook her head, her stomach twisted tight as a wet rope. He cupped his hands near the stirrup. "Step up, grab that saddle horn and hold tight." The mare's warmth radiated through Ruth's thick wool skirt as she settled onto the unfamiliar leather seat. The animal's sides expanded and contracted with each breath, a living warmth against her legs. Creaking leather and the jangle of metal bits filled her ears. Elias swung onto his gelding with fluid grace. "Follow close. Trail gets narrow ahead, and these mountains don't forgive carelessness." They rode through Timber Creek's outskirts, past weathered fence posts and into thick stands of towering pine. The horses' hooves thudded against packed earth, each step carrying Ruth farther from everything familiar. Pine needles released their sharp, clean scent as branches brushed her shoulders. Her thighs began burning after what felt like hours of steady climbing. The saddle rubbed against her legs through the thick fabric, but she bit back complaints. Mountain air tasted different, thinner, wilder, touched with the promise of snow. "Trust your mare," Elias called over his shoulder as the path narrowed to barely 2 feet wide. "She knows these trails better than most folks know their own kitchens." Ruth's knuckles whitened around the saddle horn. To her left, the trail dropped away into shadow-dark ravine where loose stones clattered into unseen depths. The trees began thinning ahead. A thin column of gray smoke rose against the azure sky, and Ruth caught the distant scent of wood smoke mixed with something else. something that made her mare suddenly shy sideways, nostrils flaring wide with alarm. Ruth's mare calmed as Elias dismounted and approached with steady, deliberate movements. The animal's trembling subsided under his practiced touch, but the wild scent still hung in the mountain air, musky, predatory. "Bears passed through yesterday," he said, stroking the horse's neck with firm gentleness. "She can still smell them on the wind." Ruth's throat constricted. Bears. Her fingers cramped tighter around the saddle horn, knuckles standing out white against weathered leather. Elias helped her down, his grip brief but steady. "They won't bother us none. Got better things to do than fight over territory with folks who respect their space." The cabin door swung open with a low groan of aged hinges. Ruth followed him across the threshold, her boots echoing against wide pine planks worn smooth by years of use. Afternoon sunlight streamed through real glass windows, not oiled paper like most frontier homes, casting golden rectangles across the spacious interior. "Kitchen's right there." Elias pointed toward a massive cast-iron cook stove that dominated the far wall. "Temperamental old gal, but she'll cook whatever you tell her once you learn her moods." Ruth ran her palm along a sturdy pine table, its surface worn smooth as silk from countless meals and years of careful use. Someone had taken considerable time to sand every inch, eliminating every splinter and rough spot. Rough-hewn shelves lined the walls, cluttered with mismatched crockery, dented tin cans, and ceramic jars. The scent of pine sap and old wood smoke permeated everything, mixed with fainter traces of coffee grounds and bacon grease. "Chickens need tending twice daily," Elias continued, his voice matter-of-fact as a preacher reading scripture. "Dawn and dusk, regular as clockwork. Cows get milked same times. There's a root cellar dug into the hillside behind the cabin for storing vegetables through winter." Ruth nodded, her neck muscles tight with concentration. Each instruction settled into her mind like seeds finding prepared soil. "Your room's up there." He gestured toward a sturdy ladder leading to a small loft area. "Built it last winter when I figured I might need—" He paused, cleared his throat roughly. "When I thought about taking a wife." Ruth's stomach dropped like a stone thrown into deep water. Wife. The word carried expectations she couldn't begin to fathom. Elias struck a sulfur match, the sharp scent filling her nostrils. He touched flame to the wick of a coal oil lamp, yellow light dancing behind clear glass. "This lamp's yours, your room, your rules up there. We'll figure the rest as we go along." He pressed the lamp's wire handle into her palm. The metal felt warm from his touch, solid and reassuring. "I don't expect." Ruth's voice cracked like dried leather. She swallowed hard. Tried again. "What do you want from me? Honest work, nothing more." His gray-green eyes met hers directly. No shifting or uncomfortable glances. "You'll earn your place here same way I earned mine through sweat and common sense." Ruth's shoulders loosened a fraction. Work. She understood work better than romance or feminine wiles. "I'll start supper," she said. "Cornmeal's in that oak barrel. Salt pork hangs in the smokehouse out back. Dried beans in the blue crock." Ruth explored the kitchen while Elias tended the horses outside. The cook stove's firebox needed feeding with split wood. She opened dampers, adjusted airflow, coaxed flames to life with movements her mother had drilled into her since childhood. Water bubbled in a dented pot. Ruth stirred cornmeal into the boiling liquid, watching it thicken into creamy mush. Salt pork sizzled in the cast-iron skillet, filling the cabin with rich, smoky aromas that made her mouth water. Elias returned as purple shadows crept down the mountainsides. He washed his hands in a tin basin, cold water splashing against metal with sharp, metallic sounds. "Smells fine?" They ate by lamplight. Metal spoons scraping against pewter bowls. The cornmeal tasted nutty and substantial. Salt pork added richness that coated Ruth's tongue with satisfying flavor. "Where'd you learn to cook proper?" Elias asked. "Mother taught me. Had to. After father died when I was 12. Mine too. Logging accident took him." Comfortable silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft crackle of settling logs in the fireplace. Outside, night sounds began: owls hooting in distant pines, cattle lowing peacefully in the fenced pasture. "I'll show you the animals tomorrow morning," Elias said. "Bossie's the brown cow with the white blaze. She's got strong opinions about strangers, but she'll warm to you given time." Ruth scraped the last cornmeal from her bowl. "How long have you lived up here?" 15 years come spring. Built most everything myself. Log by log. Why did you—" She stopped, uncertain how to finish the question without giving offense. "Choose you." His eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. "Town needed meat for winter. I needed—" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Company, I reckon. Someone to share the workload." Ruth's chest eased another degree. Company. Work. Not the romantic notions she'd feared and dreaded. "I should get some sleep," she said. "Course you should." Ruth climbed the wooden ladder, her lamp casting shifting shadows on chinked log walls. The loft contained a narrow bed covered with quilts that smelled of cedar shavings and mountain air. A small window faced east toward distant peaks barely visible in starlight. She set the lamp on a wooden crate, serving as a bedside table. Her flour sack of belongings looked pathetically small beside the bed. Ruth unpacked her spare dress, shook out the wrinkles, hung it from a wooden peg driven into the wall. Her mother's Bible joined the lamp on the makeshift table. The sewing kit found its place on the windowsill. She was reaching for her nightgown when her fingers found something unexpected in the sack's bottom corner paper wrapped around a hard, small object. Inside, a tiny envelope bore her name in her mother's careful script. But the weight felt wrong, too heavy for just paper. Ruth tore open the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside, a small silver locket caught the lamplight, its surface warm and smooth against her palm. Below it, a folded note in her mother's familiar handwriting. "This was your grandmother's. She wore it the day she chose to marry your grandfather against her family's wishes. Sometimes the choosing goes both ways. Daughter." Ruth opened the locket's tiny clasp. A miniature photograph showed a young woman with Ruth's own round face and determined jaw. She snapped it shut and tucked it into her dress pocket, the metal warm against her ribs. Dawn light crept through the loft window, painting the log walls amber. Below, she heard Elias moving around the kitchen, metal clanging against metal in an irregular rhythm. She climbed down the ladder, bare feet silent on the wooden rungs. Elias stood beside the cook-stove, frowning at its cold firebox, like a man trying to solve an impossible puzzle. "Morning," he said without looking up. "Can't get this stubborn contraption to catch proper. Keeps smoking up the whole cabin." Ruth knelt beside the stove, studying the damper settings with the same attention her mother had taught her for reading Bible verses. The intake was choked nearly shut, the flue barely cracked open. "Airflow's all wrong. she said, adjusting both dampers with careful precision. You've got her suffocating on her own smoke. Try lighting her now. Elias struck a match against the iron surface. This time the kindling caught with eager yellow flames. No smoke backing up into the room. Well, I'll be hornswoggled. Ruth filled the coffee pot with cold water from the tin pitcher, the metal chilly against her palms. What needs doing first around here? Chickens, then milking. I'll show you the routine so you can handle things proper. Outside. Morning air bit through Ruth's wool dress with teeth sharp as winter wolves. Frost silvered every blade of grass, crunching beneath her boots like broken glass. 20-odd chickens scratched and pecked in their fenced yard, clucking and squabbling over invisible treasures with the intensity of town gossips. Elias opened a wooden bin filled with cracked corn that smelled sweet and earthy. Handful for each bird, scattered wide so the weaker ones get their fair share. Ruth grabbed a fistful of grain, the kernels smooth and hard against her palm like river pebbles. She flung them in a wide arc across the yard. Chickens rushed toward the scattered corn with frantic energy, feathers ruffling, beaks darting. Just like that, Elias said. Now for the real test, bossy. The brown cow stood in a small pasture behind the cabin, her udder heavy and swollen with morning milk. Steam rose from her nostrils in the cold air. Ruth's stomach clenched as they approached the massive animal. She's bigger than she looked yesterday. 1,500 pounds of pure opinion, Elias said, patting the cow's flank with easy familiarity. But she gives the sweetest milk this side of Denver when she's in the mood for cooperation. He demonstrated first. Settling onto a 3-legged stool beside Bossy's side, his hands moved with practiced rhythm squeeze at the top. Roll the grip downward, release, and repeat. Milk hissed into the tin pail in steady white streams, foam building on the surface. Your turn. Ruth perched on the wobbly stool, her skirts bunched awkwardly around her legs. Bossy's hide felt warm and slightly coarse beneath her palms, like touching a living furnace covered in bristly carpet. The cow's breathing moved her entire massive body in slow, steady waves. Ruth wrapped her fingers around the nearest teat and squeezed hard. Nothing happened. She tried again. Harder. Bossy shifted her considerable weight from one foot to another, her tail swishing irritation like a warning flag. Gentle, but firm. Elias coached from beside the fence. Squeeze at the top first, then roll your grip down toward the end, like milking water from a wet rag. Ruth adjusted her technique, squeezing more gently at the top before rolling her grip downward. A thin stream of warm milk finally hit the pail bottom with a metallic ping. Then another slightly stronger stream. Her forearms burned from the unfamiliar motion, muscles protesting the repetitive work. That's the way. Keep the rhythm steady, and she'll settle into it. 15 minutes later. Ruth's arms trembled with exhaustion. The pail held perhaps 2 inches of creamy milk, a pathetic showing compared to Elias's effortless demonstration that had nearly filled the container. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the morning chill. Tomorrow you'll get more, Elias said, without criticism in his voice. Bossy's just testing your mettle. She does that with everyone new. Back in the kitchen, Ruth tackled breakfast with the same determination she'd applied to milking. The cook stove's temperament revealed itself through trial and considerable error. Too little air made the fire sulk and smoke like a pouting child. Too much sent flames roaring up the chimney with dangerous intensity, scorching everything it touched. Her first batch of biscuits emerged from the oven black as coal chunks, smoke streaming from their charred surfaces and filling the cabin with the acrid smell of failure. "Well," Elias said mildly, examining the ruined bread. "Reckon we know what burnt tastes like now." Ruth's cheeks burned hotter than the destroyed biscuits. "I'm sorry. I'll make more right away." "No need to apologize for learning. That stove's got a temper like a riled-up rattlesnake. Took me near 3 months to figure out her moods when I first got her." The second batch emerged golden brown and flaky, steam rising from their tender interiors like little clouds of success. Ruth split one open, the smell of properly baked bread filling her nostrils with satisfaction. "Now that's what I call proper biscuits," Elias said around a mouthful. "Light as dandelion fluff and twice as tasty." Warmth spread through Ruth's chest at his genuine praise. The days that followed settled into comfortable rhythm like a well-tuned fiddle, finding its melody. Ruth rose before dawn to coax the fire to life, her movements becoming automatic as breathing. Coffee first, then biscuits or cornbread, while Elias tended the animals outside. Breakfast eaten by lamplight, discussing the day's tasks in companionable words that carried no judgment. Milking grew easier with each passing morning. Bossy's initial suspicion mellowed into grudging acceptance, then something approaching cooperation. Ruth learned to read the cow's moods, when to approach slowly with soothing words, when to give the stubborn animal space to settle her nerves. "Red sky at night means clear tomorrow," Elias said one evening, pointing toward the western peaks where sunset painted the clouds crimson. "Red sky at dawn brings storms rolling in." Ruth memorized these mountain signs like scripture verses: wind direction, cloud formations. The way animals behaved before weather changes all became part of her expanding knowledge of this high country life. Her first truly successful venison stew emerged from the Dutch oven with meat that fell apart at the touch of a fork. Root vegetables had absorbed the rich, dark broth, their earthy flavors blending into satisfying harmony that made her mouth water just from the smell. "Best I've tasted in 15 years, Elias said, cleaning his bowl with a piece of cornbread. "You've got the touch for cooking, that's certain." Ruth's shoulders straightened with quiet pride. In town, her cooking had drawn only complaints and criticism. Here, her efforts earned genuine appreciation from someone who understood the value of a well-prepared meal. Evening routine evolved naturally as mountain twilight settled over the cabin. Supper shared by lamplight, dishes washed in heated water, then quiet hours by the crackling fire. Ruth mended clothes while Elias carved wooden tools or read from his small collection of worn books. Few words passed between them, but the silence felt companionable rather than empty. Ruth examined her hands one evening by the fireplace's flickering glow. Calluses had formed on her palms where tools and handles rubbed. Her fingernails stayed permanently rimmed with honest dirt despite thorough scrubbing. These hands looked different than the soft, useless things she'd possessed in town. "You're settling in well," Elias observed without looking up from the wooden spoon handle he was shaping with careful knife strokes. "It's good work," Ruth replied. "I can see what gets accomplished each day." "That's the blessing of mountain life. Everything you do matters in direct ways." Ruth nodded, understanding creeping through her like warmth from the fire. In town, she'd felt invisible, useless, a burden others barely tolerated. Here, her contributions were essential. The animals depended on her care. Elias relied on her cooking. Her presence made a measurable difference in their daily survival. 3 weeks passed like water flowing downhill. Ruth's milking technique improved until she could nearly match Elias's output. The chickens came running when they spotted her approaching with their grain. Even the temperamental cook stove behaved with increasing reliability under her patient management. She was hanging laundry on the rope line behind the cabin one crisp morning when movement caught her attention. A lone rider approached through the trees, his horse picking its way carefully up the steep mountain trail. Ruth squinted against the bright morning sun, trying to identify the visitor. As he drew closer, recognition hit her like cold water thrown in her face. Sheriff Murphy. The same man who'd organized that humiliating wife selection ceremony in the town square. His presence here could only mean one thing: trouble from town was climbing up their mountain. Ruth's hands clenched the wet sheet she'd been hanging. Her pulse hammered in her throat as Murphy's horse climbed the final stretch toward their peaceful cabin. But as the sheriff's weathered face became clear in the morning light, Ruth noticed something that made her blood turn cold as mountain snow. He wasn't riding alone. Ruth dropped the wet sheet back into the laundry basket, her fingers stiff with sudden cold. Behind Sheriff Murphy rode a second figure, her mother, hunched forward in her saddle like a sack of grain about to slide off. "Murphy!" Elias called, emerging from the barn with hay clinging to his wool shirt. "What brings you folks up here?" The sheriff dismounted, his horse blowing hard from the steep climb. Sweat darkened the animal's neck despite the crisp morning air. "Mrs. Caldwell wanted to check on her daughter. Figured I'd better bring her up myself, rather than let her ride alone on these narrow trails." Ruth's mother slid from her horse with obvious relief, her legs shaking slightly as her boots touched solid ground. Her face looked pinched and drawn, older than Ruth remembered from just 3 weeks ago. "Ruth." No warmth colored her voice, just careful assessment. Her eyes swept over Ruth's calloused hands, her practical wool dress, the confident way she stood beside Elias without shrinking into herself. "You look different." "I feel different. Good different or bad different?" Ruth considered the question with the same seriousness she'd give to measuring flour for bread. 3 weeks ago, she would have automatically deferred to her mother's judgment about everything. Now she felt her spine straighten like a young tree finding sunlight. "Good." Her mother's eyebrows rose slightly, surprise flickering across her weathered features. "Well then, I brought some things I thought you might have need of." She pulled a cloth-wrapped bundle from her saddlebag, extra thread spools, a small hand mirror, 2 mason jars of her famous peach preserves that smelled like summer sunshine. "Thank you. Mother, that's thoughtful." And they shared coffee and cold biscuits at the kitchen table, the conversation careful and polite as Sunday church social. Ruth served her unexpected guests with steady hands, no longer the nervous girl who'd left town with trembling knees. Her mother noticed everything: the efficiently organized shelves, the perfectly banked fire in the cook stove. The way Elias asked Ruth's opinion about winter preparations. "She's doing well for herself," Sheriff Murphy said to Elias, as if Ruth weren't sitting right there at the same table. "She's doing more than well," Elias replied firmly, his voice carrying protective edge. "She's earned her place here through honest work and good sense." Warmth spread through Ruth's chest at his words like hot coffee on a cold morning. After the visitors departed, promising to check back in another month, Ruth stood in her reorganized kitchen, studying the cluttered shelves with fresh eyes. Elias stored items by size rather than function: large cast-iron pots crowded next to small spice tins, preserving jars mixed randomly with everyday dishes like a child's scattered toys. These shelves could hold twice as much if we grouped things by use instead of size, she said that evening while Elias whittled by the fireplace. Cedar shavings curled away from his knife blade in perfect spirals. He looked up from the wooden handle, taking shape beneath his careful work. How do you figure cooking items together in one section, preserving supplies grouped separate, daily dishes apart from special occasion pieces? Ruth traced patterns in the air with her finger, visualizing the changes. Less hunting around for what you need when you're trying to get supper on. I've been doing it my way for 15 years. Ruth's chin lifted slightly, the same stubborn angle her grandmother's portrait had shown in the locket. Doesn't mean it's the only way that works. Silence stretched between them like a rope under tension. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs, waiting for the sharp rebuke she'd learned to expect whenever she disagreed with someone. Instead, Elias set down his whittling, wood and knife clattering gently against the stone hearth. Show me what you mean. Ruth pulled a wooden crate from behind the stove, her movements quick with sudden enthusiasm. If we put all the cooking pots here, and the everyday plates right there, she demonstrated, moving items with the same efficiency she'd learned for organizing her sewing supplies. Everything you need for preparing a meal stays within arm's reach. Elias watched her work without comment, his gray-green eyes following her systematic rearrangement. When she finished, the kitchen looked transformed, logical, efficient, purposeful as a well-designed tool. Food stores better in cool spots, too, Ruth continued, moving preserving jars toward the shadier north wall. Less spoilage when summer heat hits means less waste come winter. Makes considerable sense, Elias said, picking up his knife and resuming his careful shaping of cedar wood. You've got a natural head for organization. I made it through 6th grade before Pa died, and Mother needed me working at home, Ruth said, then immediately regretted revealing so much personal history. 6th grade, Elias's hands stilled in their work. That's more schooling than most folks around here ever see. What about you? 2nd grade, maybe 3rd? Pa needed me for trapping soon as I could handle a rifle without shooting my own foot off. Ruth studied his weathered face, noting the intelligence in his eyes despite the limited formal education. You read well enough for someone who quit school early. Taught myself mostly. Gets lonely up here with just books for company through the long winters. He gestured toward a small shelf, holding perhaps a dozen well-worn volumes. Read those so many times I can recite whole passages word for word. Ruth examined the titles, a farmer's almanac with a cracked leather spine. McGuffey's Reader held together with string, several adventure novels with faded covers, and a thick volume about animal husbandry that looked like it had survived a flood. All showed signs of heavy use, pages soft from countless readings. I could read to you, she offered carefully. Evenings, when the work's finished? You'd do that? Fair trade. You've taught me milking and weather signs and how to manage that temperamental stove. I could share what I know about reading. That night, Ruth opened the farmer's almanac by flickering tallow candlelight. Her voice filled the cabin with words about planting seasons, lunar cycles, and weather predictions, while Elias listened and shaped cedar into smooth, useful forms. The prudent farmer observes celestial signs, Ruth read aloud, noting how the moon's phases affect both crops and livestock behavior. True enough, Elias said, his knife pausing in its steady work. Cows always get restless before storms roll in. Chickens stop laying regular when weather's about to change. Ruth turned the page, studying the careful diagrams. Preservation of foodstuffs requires careful attention to temperature, moisture levels, and air circulation. That's why you moved those preserving jars to the north wall, partly, but also because glass breaks easier when it freezes solid. North wall stays warmer through winter storms. Elias nodded thoughtfully. Never considered that particular angle. As Ruth continued reading, she noticed how Elias's questions revealed deep practical knowledge. He might lack formal schooling, but he understood mountain life with an intimacy that surpassed any textbook learning. Root vegetables store best in cool, dark conditions with adequate ventilation. She read from the preservation section. Built that root cellar with exactly those principles in mind, Elias said with quiet pride. Dug it right into the hillside where the earth stays cool year-round. Smart planning. Learned through trial and costly error. Lost near half my first winter's food supplies to spoilage. Ruth closed the almanac and reached for McGuffey's reader, its familiar weight comforting in her hands. What about this one? Stories mostly, some poetry, history lessons about the early days. She opened to a random page and began reading a passage about westward expansion, her voice giving life to the formal text that described their own mountain territory. You read like a proper school teacher, Elias observed, genuine admiration coloring his voice. Mrs. Henderson always said I had a natural gift for it, made me help the younger students with their daily lessons. Must have been hard, leaving school so early. Ruth paused, considering how much personal history to reveal. Mother said book learning wouldn't help me find a husband. Said I needed to focus on practical household skills. Book learning is practical, Elias said firmly, his knife emphasizing the point with a decisive cut. Just a different kind of practical than most folks recognize. Warmth spread through Ruth's chest at his words. For the first time in years, someone valued her mind as much as her hands. What's this one about? She picked up a slim volume titled Frontier Survival Guide. Trapping techniques mostly, how to read animal signs, set proper snares, dress pelts for trading. Elias's knife paused in its careful work. 12 long winters I lived alone up here, with nothing but my traps, and that book for regular company. Lonely, peaceful mostly, but he searched for the right words like a man feeling his way through dark woods. Gets quiet. Too quiet sometimes when your own voice is all you hear for months on end. Ruth understood completely. The silence of rejection differed from the silence of solitude, but both carried their own particular weight. I like the balance we've found here, she said carefully. Me too. Elias resumed his whittling with steady strokes. Like having someone worth sharing the evening hours with. They settled into comfortable quiet. Ruth reading silently while Elias shaped wood into useful forms. Outside. Night sounds began their familiar chorus owls calling across the dark mountains, wind sighing through pine branches like whispered conversations. Ruth reached for the farmer's almanac again, but her fingers knocked against something unexpected wedged between its pages. A folded paper fell onto her lap. She unfolded it carefully by lamplight. Written in Elias's careful script were several lines of text, obviously copied from one of his books. The mountain man lives by different laws than civilized society. He answers to no authority save his own conscience and the harsh demands of survival. In this unforgiving land, a man's worth gets measured not by his birth or accumulated wealth, but by his character and proven capabilities. Ruth's breath caught in her throat. Below Elias's copied passage, someone else had added a note in different handwriting, delicate feminine script she didn't recognize. And sometimes, a woman's worth is discovered in exactly the same way. But as Ruth studied the mysterious addition more closely, She realized the handwriting looked disturbingly familiar. It matched her grandmother's script from the note in the locket. Ruth held the paper closer to the lamplight, studying the feminine script. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she compared it mentally to her grandmother's note from the locket. "Whose handwriting is this?" she asked, her voice carefully steady. Elias looked up from his whittling. Cedar shavings scattered around his boots like fallen leaves. His eyes fixed on the paper in Ruth's trembling hands. "Where'd you find that tucked in your almanac?" Ruth's throat felt dry as autumn dust. "Someone wrote about women's worth. Who was she?" Elias set down his knife, the wooden handle clattering against the stone hearth. "My sister Margaret. She stayed here one winter, years back. You never mentioned having a sister. Died of fever the following spring, down in Colorado, trying to make her way to California." His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled like a banked fire. "Lost her just when she was starting to find her place in the world." Ruth studied the careful script again, noting the confident loops and precise letters. She wrote this about women finding their worth. Margaret always said society got things backward, judged women by their looks and men by their wealth, instead of measuring folks by their character. Elias reached for the paper with gentle fingers. "Can I have that back?" Ruth handed it over, watching him fold it with the same reverence he'd show a Bible page. "She sounds wise. Wiser than me. Anyway, told me I'd find someone worth sharing this place with. Eventually." He tucked the paper back between the almanac's pages. "Reckon she was right about that." Warmth spread through Ruth's chest like hot cider on a cold morning. But before she could respond, wind rattled the cabin's shutters with sudden violence. "Storm's coming," Elias said, rising to check the leather hinges on the windows. "Big one, from the sound of it." Rain began as scattered drops against the roof, individual taps that quickly escalated into drumming that filled the cabin with constant noise. Wind howled around the corners like a living thing, testing every joint and board with relentless pressure. By morning, the world outside had disappeared behind sheets of driving rain. Elias peered through the kitchen window, water streaming down the glass in thick rivulets. "Can't see the barn from here," he said, his breath fogging the cold glass. "This'll last a good while." Ruth stirred oatmeal at the stove, the wooden spoon scraping against cast iron with rhythmic persistence. "How long do these mountain storms usually run? 2-3 days, maybe. Sometimes longer if the wind keeps feeding it." Elias pulled his wool coat tighter around his shoulders. "Mountain storms don't quit easy once they get their dander up." The first day passed peacefully enough. Ruth organized the pantry shelves while Elias repaired harness leather by lamplight. Rain hammered the roof in steady rhythm like an army marching overhead. Wind moaned through the chimney, making the fire dance and flicker in unpredictable patterns. But by the second morning, the cabin felt smaller with each passing hour. Every footstep echoed against the walls. Every breath seemed to take up precious space in the confined quarters. Ruth swept the kitchen floor for the third time, her broom whisking across boards that were already spotless. The repetitive motion helped calm her nerves, but she caught herself glancing toward the windows every few minutes, watching water cascade down the glass. Elias sat at the table, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, the same task he'd completed thoroughly just yesterday morning. The clicking of metal parts against each other filled the spaces between wind gusts. "You don't need to clean that rifle again," Ruth said, her voice sharper than she'd intended. The constant clicking was grating against her nerves like fingernails on slate. "Equipment needs proper maintenance," Elias replied, without looking up from the gleaming barrel. "You maintained it fine yesterday, and the day before that." He paused in his cleaning, metal pieces suspended in his hands. "Something wrong with keeping my gear in good working order." Ruth dumped the dustpan with more force than necessary, sending dust motes dancing in the lamplight. "Nothing's wrong with it. It's just—" She gestured around the spotless cabin. "We're running out of things to do. Plenty to do if you look for it. Mending, reading, planning for winter supplies. I've mended everything twice. You've read 3 chapters of that same book without turning a page. And we've planned winter supplies down to the last dried bean." Elias resumed assembling his rifle, metal clicking against metal with increased intensity. Mountain life means being prepared for anything. Can't just— His boots, those muddy boots he'd left by the door again, despite Ruth's careful organization of the entryway. Dark soil tracked across her freshly swept floor in irregular patterns that destroyed the neat appearance she'd worked to maintain. "Would it kill you to clean your boots before tracking mud through my kitchen?" The words escaped before Ruth could catch them. Elias looked up, his eyebrows drawing together. "What's that now? Your boots. Every single day you track mud through my clean kitchen. Every day I sweep it up like some hired girl. Every day you do it again without a thought." "They're just boots. Ruth, just boots." Ruth's voice climbed higher, echoing off the log walls. "I spend hours every day keeping this place organized, making it livable instead of looking like a bachelor's mess, and you can't be bothered to wipe your feet." Elias stood slowly, his rifle forgotten on the table. "Bachelor's mess." Ruth's hands clenched the broom handle until her knuckles showed white. "Look around you, Elias. 15 years of doing whatever you pleased, however you pleased it, leaving things wherever they landed. No consideration for anyone else because there wasn't anyone else to consider. 15 years I've done fine without someone rearranging my entire life to suit their particular notions," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Rearranging." Ruth slammed the broom against the wall hard enough to rattle the dishes. "I've tried to make this place better, more efficient, more civilized. But every time I turn around, you've undone half my work because you can't break 15 years of careless habits." "Careless habits." Elias stepped closer, his gray-green eyes hard as winter stone. "These careless habits kept me alive up here when civilized folks like you wouldn't last a week in this country." Ruth's face burned with shame and anger. "Civilized folks like me. Town folks. Soft folks. People who think survival means having everything arranged just so instead of making do with what actually works." "What works?" Ruth laughed, but no humor touched the bitter sound. "Chaos works. Waste works. Living like some kind of animal works." The words hung in the air between them like a physical slap. Elias's face went white, then flushed, dark red as fresh blood. "Get out!" Ruth's breath caught in her throat. "What? You heard me plain enough. Get out of my kitchen. Get out of my sight." Ruth's legs trembled as she climbed the ladder to her loft, each rung feeling unsteady beneath her weight. Behind her, Elias's boots stomped across the floor, tracking more mud. No doubt. The kitchen door slammed hard enough to shake the entire cabin. Ruth sat on her narrow bed, staring at the storm-darkened window. Rain lashed the glass like thrown gravel, Wind screamed around the cabin's corners with increasing fury that matched the turmoil in her chest. Living like an animal. Had she really said those terrible words? Her stomach churned as the phrase echoed in her memory. She'd seen Elias's face when the words hit the way he'd flinched, as if she'd struck him with her fist instead of just her tongue. 15 years he'd lived alone up here, built this cabin with his own hands, log by careful log, survived winters that would kill most people, provided for himself through skill and determination. And she'd called him an animal. Ruth buried her face in her hands, her grandmother's locket pressing against her ribs through the fabric. Her mother's voice whispered from childhood memory. "You've got a sharp tongue, girl. Someday it'll cut someone deeper than you mean to." Below, she heard Elias moving around the kitchen with unnecessary force, boots stomping, cabinet doors slamming, the clash of pots and pans handled with barely controlled anger. Hours passed like years. The storm grew worse, if anything. Rain drumming against the roof with rifle-shot intensity. Wind howled, with voices that sounded almost human in their anguish. Ruth's stomach cramped with hunger, but she couldn't face going downstairs. Not yet. Not while Elias's justified anger filled the cabin like smoke from a badly tended fire. Darkness fell early, the storm swallowing what little daylight managed to penetrate the thick clouds. Ruth lay on her bed, fully clothed, listening to the cabin creak and groan under nature's assault. Thunder crashed directly overhead, shaking the entire structure. A soft knock interrupted her misery. "Ruth," Elias's voice, muffled by the thick door. "Ruth, can we talk?" Ruth stared at the ceiling, counting the chinks between logs. Her throat felt tight and raw. "Ruth, please." She climbed down the ladder slowly, each step requiring conscious effort. Elias stood beside the kitchen table, his hands hanging loose at his sides. His face looked older somehow, carved with new lines of exhaustion and regret. Thunder crashed again outside, rattling the windows in their frames. But Elias spoke first into the echoing silence. "I was wrong. You deserved better than that." Ruth stood in the lamplight, rain hammering overhead like an angry giant pounding the roof. Elias's weathered face carried lines she'd never noticed before, deep grooves carved by years of mountain winters and solitude. "I called you an animal," Ruth whispered. "That was cruel and wrong." "Maybe we both said things we didn't mean." Elias gestured toward the kitchen table. "Storms got us both edgy." They sat across from each other, the silence less comfortable than before, but no longer hostile. Outside, wind howled with undiminished fury, testing every board and nail holding their shelter together. "I don't want to fight with you," Ruth said finally. "Me neither." Ruth heated leftover stew while Elias built up the fire with split pine logs. The familiar domestic routine helped ease the tension between them, like salve on a burn. They ate without much conversation, but the sharp edge of anger had dulled. "I do appreciate the organizing you've done," Elias said as Ruth cleared their bowls. "Kitchen works better now. Makes considerable sense, the way you've arranged things." Ruth scrubbed a pot with careful attention, her hands working in steady circles. "I shouldn't have criticized your habits so harshly. They kept you alive up here all these years. Maybe some of them could use improving, though." Ruth glanced over her shoulder. Elias sat in his chair by the fire, but his muddy boots sat neatly beside the door instead of tracking dirt across her clean floor. "Storm should break by tomorrow," he said, studying the flames. "Good. Cabin feels smaller when we're trapped inside." Ruth dried the last spoon and hung the dish towel on its wooden peg, and the argument had cleared something between them, not just the air, but deeper understanding about respect and consideration. The storm broke near dawn, with morning sunlight streaming through cleared windows. Ruth was feeding chickens their morning grain when hoofbeats announced an approaching visitor, Jake Morrison, the monthly supply rider, emerged from the pine trees on his tired horse. But something was wrong with his usual cheerful demeanor. His shoulders slumped forward, and his pack mule carried lighter loads than normal. "Morning, Mrs. Morgan," Jake called, dismounting with obvious weariness. "Elias around?" "Right here," Elias said, emerging from the barn with hay dust on his shirt sleeves. "You're early this month, Jake." "Had to be." Jake removed his hat, running fingers through sweat-dampened hair despite the cool morning air. "Brought what supplies I could manage, but pickings are mighty slim down in town." Ruth's stomach tightened with sudden unease. "What's happened?" "Early frost hit hard 2 weeks back. Killed near half the corn crop before harvest time." Jake's voice carried defeat, like a man announcing a death in the family. "Wheat's gone black with blight disease. Worst crop failure anybody can remember." Ruth set down her grain bucket, cold dread creeping up her spine. How bad is it really? Bad enough that folks are talking serious about packing up before winter sets in hard, heading south where there's still food to buy. Jake shook his head, exhaustion written across his weathered features. "Mayor Patterson's beside himself. Says we might lose half the town's population." Ruth's mind began working automatically, calculating numbers the way she'd learned to figure household expenses. Town population around 300 souls. Half would mean 150 people needing food through 5 months of harsh winter. How much food would that require per day? Per week? Per month? "What about supply trains from Denver?" Elias asked. "Railroads running behind schedule on account of early snow in the high passes. Won't reach us till spring, if we're lucky." Jake pulled a pathetically small sack from his pack. "This is all the flour I could scrape together. Mrs. Henderson paid double normal price just to get this much." The flour sack looked pitifully inadequate, maybe 10 pounds for a family of 6 to last until spring. "People are scared," Jake continued, his voice heavy with worry. "Mrs. Patterson's already started packing their wagon. The Hendersons are selling off their livestock cheap, planning to head out when the first real snow hits." Ruth studied the meager contents of Jake's reduced pack. A few dented tins of goods, some dried beans. Precious little else. Down in town, families would be panicking, hoarding what little they possessed, making poor decisions based on fear instead of careful planning. "Jake," she said slowly, "what exactly are folks eating right now?" "Whatever they can find or afford, root vegetables that survived the frost, some late apples from the older trees, game meat when the men get lucky hunting." He gestured helplessly with both hands. "Not near enough to see anyone through a hard winter." Ruth walked to her organized pantry, taking inventory with critical eyes trained by weeks of careful household management. Preserved vegetables from their productive garden, salt pork hanging in the smokehouse, sacks of cornmeal and flour, properly stored to prevent spoilage, dried beans, root vegetables in the cool cellar, enough food to keep 2 people comfortable through the coldest months. Numbers clicked together in her mind, like puzzle pieces finding their proper places. Mathematics didn't lie. It revealed truth without sentiment or emotion. "How much food does the town have altogether?" Ruth asked. Jake scratched his graying beard thoughtfully. "Hard to say exact figures. Maybe enough for 2 months if folks are careful with portions." But they're not being careful. Are they? Ruth turned to face him directly. They're hoarding individually instead of pooling resources. They're eating the best food first instead of rationing properly. They're letting fresh produce spoil instead of preserving it. Well, I suppose that's about right, Jake said, confusion creeping into his voice at her intensity. Ruth pulled her notebook from the kitchen shelf, the same one where she tracked their food supplies and consumption with mathematical precision. Pages of careful calculations, meal planning schedules, preservation techniques. 5 people can eat adequately on what 3 consume if you plan properly, she said, running her finger down columns of neat figures. Stretch meat with beans and root vegetables. Use every part of every animal. Preserve surplus immediately when you have it. Ration carefully when supplies run low. Elias was staring at her with growing understanding. Ruth, what are you thinking? I'm thinking they're looking at this crisis all wrong. Ruth's voice carried quiet certainty that surprised even herself. They see disaster coming. I see a calculation problem that needs solving. Jake's eyebrows rose skeptically. Calculation problem. Ruth pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing rapid figures. 300 people. Average daily consumption per person. Estimated available food supplies. Proper rationing schedules. Her pencil scratched against paper with urgent intensity. If managed correctly with proper preservation techniques, what you've described could feed everyone through till spring planting. Managed by who? Jake asked. Ain't nobody in town knows this kind of detailed figuring. Ruth looked up from her calculations, meeting his skeptical gaze directly. I do. The words hung in the morning air like smoke from a gunshot. Jake glanced at Elias, uncertainty written across his sun-weathered face. Ruth's got a natural head for organization, Elias said quietly. Turned this whole place around in just a few weeks. But she's... Jake stopped himself. But his unfinished meaning filled the silence anyway. What? Ruth's chin lifted with familiar stubbornness. She's the fat girl nobody wanted. The one you all laughed at during that wife auction in the town square. Jake's face reddened like a schoolboy caught in mischief. I didn't mean nothing by, yes, you did mean something. Ruth closed her notebook with sharp precision. And you're absolutely right. I am that same girl, the one they put on display like livestock, the one who got chosen last and laughed at most. She walked to the window overlooking the valley below. Morning mist rising from the distant town. I'm also the girl who just figured out how to keep your town from starving to death. Jake shifted his weight uncomfortably from one boot to the other. Ruth, I never meant to. My mother was right about one thing. Ruth continued, her voice steady as mountain stone. Book learning is useless if you don't apply it to real problems. Well, I'm ready to apply everything I've learned. Question is, are they ready to accept help from someone they've spent years treating like worthless trash? She turned back to face both men, her notebook held against her chest like armor. Behind her, autumn sunlight streamed through the window, outlining her solid figure with golden light. Folks are desperate enough to listen to anybody with answers, Jake said finally. Are they really? Ruth challenged. Desperate enough to follow orders from the girl they used to call the cow. Desperate enough to trust their survival to someone they wouldn't even speak to just 6 months ago. Jake's uncomfortable silence provided her answer. Ruth opened her notebook again, studying her precise calculations. The numbers didn't lie or judge or mock. She could save them every man, woman, and child in that frightened town. But saving people who'd spent years crushing her spirit would require something she wasn't certain she possessed. The courage to expose herself to their judgment One more time. I need to think about this, she said finally, after Jake left, promising to return within the week for her answer. Ruth sat by the fire with her notebook spread across her lap. The wounded dog they'd rescued during the storm lay at her feet, his presence somehow comforting. You don't owe them anything, Elias said quietly from his chair. No, Ruth agreed, touching her grandmother's locket through her dress fabric. I don't owe them a blessed thing. So why are you considering helping them? Ruth studied her careful calculations, each number representing lives that might be saved or lost based on her decision. Because being able to help and choosing not to would make me just like them. Outside, autumn wind rustled through pine branches with the whisper of approaching winter. Down in the valley, 300 people faced the prospect of starvation because they'd never learned what Ruth had discovered up here, that survival required community cooperation, systematic organization, and the wisdom to value substance over appearance. She was still pondering when rapid hoofbeats announced another visitor approaching through the trees. This time it wasn't Jake Morrison. Sheriff Murphy rode up the trail, followed by a desperate delegation from Town Mayor Patterson, Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Williams. Their faces carried the grim exhaustion of people who'd run out of hope and options. At the back of the group, hunched forward in her saddle, like shame, given human form, rode Ruth's mother. But as they dismounted in the muddy yard, Ruth noticed something that made her blood run cold. They weren't here to ask for help. They were here to demand it. Ruth watched the delegation dismount through her kitchen window, their faces carrying the grim determination of people who'd convinced themselves they deserved salvation. Mayor Patterson's usually pristine coat bore mud stains and wrinkled creases. Mrs. Henderson's cheeks had hollowed beneath prominent cheekbones, her once plump figure gaunt with worry. Dr. Williams clutched his worn medical bag like a lifeline, his shoulders hunched against more than just the autumn chill. Sheriff Murphy approached the cabin door with heavy steps, his boots leaving deep prints in the soft earth. Behind him, the others clustered in uncomfortable silence, their eyes avoiding direct contact with Ruth through the glass. Ruth opened the door before he could knock. Mrs. Morgan, Murphy said, removing his hat. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool mountain air, and his hands trembled slightly. We've come to speak with Elias about winter hunting arrangements. Town's got needs that require immediate attention. Ruth stepped aside, allowing them entry into her organized kitchen. The cabin felt crowded with 6 additional bodies pressed into the space she'd made her own. Mayor Patterson's eyes swept over her efficiently arranged shelves with obvious surprise, noting the systematic organization that spoke of competent management. Elias is checking the snare lines, Ruth said, her voice steady. Should be back within the hour. Her mother lingered near the door, studying Ruth's calloused hands and practical wool dress, the confident way Ruth moved through her own space serving coffee. Organizing seating, managing the domestic details seemed to unsettle her more than words could have. Coffee, Ruth offered, already moving toward the stove. That would be... Yes. Thank you kindly, Dr. Williams said, sinking into a chair with obvious exhaustion. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually steady hands shook as he set down his medical bag. It's been a long, hard ride up these mountain trails. Ruth filled the coffee pot with practiced efficiency, measuring grounds with the precise movements of someone who'd learned to manage resources carefully. The delegation watched her motions, sure, purposeful, competent. Nothing like the clumsy, uncertain girl they remembered from town. "Jake Morrison said you folks are having supply troubles," Ruth said while coffee heated, sending rich aromas through the cabin. Mayor Patterson cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "Some temporary difficulties. Yes, early frost damaged crops more than expected. We're exploring various options for winter provisioning." Exploring options. Ruth turned to face him directly, her gaze level and unflinching. "Jake said half the town's planning to abandon their homes and head south." Patterson's face reddened like a man caught in an outright lie. "Temporary setback, nothing more. Nothing we can't manage with proper planning and cooperation." Ruth poured steaming coffee into mismatched cups, serving each person with steady hands that never trembled or spilled. Her mother accepted the cup without meeting Ruth's eyes, shame written across her weathered features. "How much food do you have in total?" Ruth asked, settling into her chair with notebook and pencil within easy reach. "I don't see how that's any concern of," Patterson began with renewed bluster. "Maybe 2 months' worth if we're careful with portions." Dr. Williams interrupted quietly, exhaustion overriding political niceties. "Possibly less if winter runs longer than normal." Ruth pulled her notebook from the kitchen shelf, where she kept her household accounts. The delegation watched with growing attention as she opened it to reveal pages covered with neat calculations, food consumption charts, detailed preservation schedules. 2 months for how many people exactly? 300 souls, give or take a few families. Sheriff Murphy said, "That's counting children and elderly folks." Ruth's pencil moved across fresh paper, calculating with rapid precision. Average adult requires roughly 2 pounds of food daily to maintain health through hard winter months. Children need less, but pregnant women and nursing mothers require more. She looked up, her voice carrying quiet authority. "You're rationing everything wrong," Patterson sputtered with indignation. "What does a girl like you possibly know about 5 families could eat adequately on what 3 are consuming if managed properly?" Ruth continued, ignoring his interruption entirely. Her voice filled the room with unshakable certainty. "Stretch meat with beans and root vegetables. Use bones for rich broth. Preserve surplus immediately instead of letting it spoil in storage." She turned to a fresh page, beginning new calculations with swift, confident strokes. "Available food supplies, distributed efficiently with proper preservation techniques and systematic waste elimination." Her pencil scratched against paper while the room held its breath. Numbers accumulated in neat, precise columns. 3 months of adequate nutrition, possibly 4 if hunting supplements the stored supplies. Dr. Williams leaned forward with growing excitement. "You've worked all this out in detail. Basic mathematics combined with practical knowledge," Ruth said, showing him her figures. "Caloric requirements per person, nutritional balance to prevent deficiency diseases, proper storage methods to minimize spoilage through winter months." The doctor studied her calculations, his eyebrows rising with each line he examined. "These figures are quite sophisticated. Where did you learn such detailed planning?" "6th grade arithmetic," Ruth said matter-of-factly. "Plus common sense about food management that most folks seem to lack." Her mother finally spoke, her voice cracking with emotion. "Ruth always was the smartest one in our family." Heavy silence filled the kitchen like smoke from a poorly managed fire. Outside, Elias's boots sounded on the porch steps, accompanied by the soft thud of freshly killed rabbits being set down. He entered carrying 2 fat rabbits, their bodies still warm from recent death, rich scent of wild game filling the cabin. "Folks," he acknowledged the delegation with a polite nod, then looked to Ruth with questioning eyes. "Everything going all right here?" "They came about winter hunting," Ruth said, her voice carrying undertones Elias would understand. "We need meat," Patterson said quickly, seizing the opening like a drowning man grabbing driftwood. "With crop failures, game will be essential for community survival through the coming months." Elias hung the rabbits from kitchen hooks with practiced motions. "I can supply some, but not near enough for 300 people through 5 months of mountain winter." "What if you had proper help?" Ruth asked quietly. All eyes turned toward her, the cabin falling silent except for coffee percolating on the stove. She closed her notebook, meeting each gaze steadily without flinching. "Organized hunting parties working systematic territories, proper preservation of every animal taken meat, organs, bones for broth, hides for trade goods, efficient butchering that wastes nothing." Ruth's voice gained strength with each word, filling the room with authority none of them had expected. "Coordinated with systematic food distribution and scientific rationing schedules." Mayor Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sweat beading despite the cool air. Who would organize such a complex operation? Ruth's chin lifted slightly, the same stubborn angle her grandmother had shown in the locket photograph. "I would—" The silence that followed felt heavy as mountain stone about to avalanche. "Ruth," her mother began, her voice breaking. "I can save your town," Ruth said with quiet firmness that brooked no argument. "I can organize efficient food distribution, establish proper rationing schedules, coordinate hunting and preservation activities. I can turn your 2 months of disorganized supplies into 4 months of systematic survival, maybe 5 with careful management." Dr. Williams cleared his throat. "The knowledge required for such an undertaking is sitting right here in this notebook," Ruth said, tapping the leather cover with authority. 6 weeks of planning, calculating, organizing every detail, everything your town needs to survive winter without losing a single soul." Sheriff Murphy studied her face with growing respect. "You'd really do that? After everything that's happened? After what?" Ruth's voice stayed level as lake water. "After being displayed like livestock at auction, after years of mockery and public humiliation." Patterson's face darkened with renewed bluster. "Now see here, young woman. I see perfectly clear." Ruth interrupted, her voice cutting through his objections like a sharp knife. "You're desperate. Your people are terrified. Your leaders have run completely out of ideas and options." She stood, moving to the window that overlooked the valley below where their town waited. "And the girl you all considered worthless trash might be your only hope for survival." Her mother's voice cracked with tears. "Ruth, please, please what? Mother." Ruth turned back to face the room. "Please forget how you shoved me into that humiliating lineup. Please pretend the whole town didn't treat me like a burden nobody wanted to carry." Tears tracked down her mother's weathered cheeks, cutting clean lines through the dust of hard traveling. "I was wrong about so many things." "Yes," Ruth said simply. "You were wrong about most everything." Dr. Williams broke the painful silence with practical urgency. "What would you require from us to provide this help?" Ruth considered the question with the same seriousness she'd give to planning a year's worth of meals. Complete authority over food distribution, no hoarding, no special treatment for wealthy families, no arguments about my decisions. Everyone follows the rationing schedule exactly as I establish it. And if people refuse to take orders from— Patterson stopped himself mid-sentence. From the fat girl, Ruth finished, without hesitation. Then they can explain to their hungry children why pride mattered more than survival. Mrs. Henderson spoke for the first time since arriving, her voice carrying maternal desperation. My youngest is 6 years old. Little Mary's already asking why there's never enough food on her plate. Her voice broke completely. I'll follow any plan that keeps my children fed through winter. So will I, Dr. Williams said firmly. The medical evidence supports your calculations completely. One by one. The delegation members voiced agreement with increasing enthusiasm. Even Patterson eventually nodded, his resistance crumbling before practical necessity and mathematical certainty. Ruth opened her notebook again, revealing pages of detailed planning that represented weeks of careful thought. Hunting schedules organized by territory, preservation techniques for different types of meat and vegetables, rationing charts based on family size and individual nutritional needs, distribution points established to ensure fair access for every family. Sheriff Murphy studied the organized plans with growing amazement. This is comprehensive beyond anything we could have hoped for. It's survival, Ruth said simply. Nothing more, nothing less than what's required. Elias stepped forward with quiet pride. Ruth's got a natural gift for organization. Your town's lucky she's willing to share it with folks who haven't always treated her kindly. We're grateful, Dr. Williams said with genuine sincerity. Truly grateful for this opportunity. Ruth met his eyes steadily. Gratitude won't feed hungry families through winter storms. Only proper planning and disciplined execution will accomplish that. When can you start? Mrs. Henderson asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time. I'll need 3 days to review current supplies and establish initial distribution points in town. After that, we begin rationing immediately according to my calculations. Ruth's voice carried unshakable authority that surprised even herself. No exceptions, no delays, no second-guessing my decisions based on hurt feelings. The delegation prepared to leave, their faces showing mixture of relief and residual discomfort at accepting help from someone they'd scorned. Ruth's mother lingered as the others mounted their horses in the muddy yard. I'm proud of you, she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Your father would be proud, too. Ruth studied her mother's face, the lines of worry carved by years of struggle, the marks of regret for opportunities missed and words spoken in anger. I know you did your best with what you understood then. I should have seen your worth much earlier. Maybe so, Ruth said, her voice softening slightly. But you see it now. That's what matters for moving forward. After the delegation departed down the mountain trail, promising to prepare the town for her arrival, Ruth stood on the cabin porch with Elias. The rescued dog limped out to join them, his recovery progressing steadily under their care. Proud of you, Elias said quietly, his arm settling around her shoulders. Scared to death, Ruth admitted honestly. What if my calculations don't account for something important? What if winter runs longer than expected? Then we adjust our plans and keep working the problem, Elias said with mountain pragmatism. That's all anyone can do when facing the unknown. Ruth nodded, feeling the weight of 300 lives settling across her shoulders like a heavy winter cloak. Tomorrow she would ride down to town and begin the most important work of her entire life. But tonight, as she prepared her final notes by flickering lamplight, a troubling thought nagged at the edges of her mind. The delegation had been desperate enough to accept her help without question. But would the rest of the town follow orders from someone they'd spent years treating with contempt? More importantly, as she reviewed her carefully calculated plans one final time, she noticed something in her figures that made her blood run cold. She'd made a critical error in her initial calculations. Ruth stared at her notebook by lamplight, her pencil tracing the error that could doom them all. She'd miscalculated the children's food requirements. They needed more calories during growth spurts, not less. Her figures were short by nearly 3 weeks of supplies. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead as she reworked the numbers. 300 people. Actual consumption rates, available food stores. The mathematics cut brutal truth through her optimistic projections. 2.5 months, not 4. Her hands trembled as she reached for fresh paper, starting new calculations. But this time, she factored in everything she'd learned about mountain survival from Elias. Wild plants. Root vegetables most folks ignored. Game birds beyond standard hunting. Every scrap of nutrition the land could provide. The answer came slowly, line by careful line. If families gathered pine nuts, if hunting parties targeted smaller game like rabbits and squirrels, if they used fish from the stream, if every household learned proper food preservation, still possible, barely. Ruth closed her notebook and climbed to bed, but sleep came in fitful pieces. Tomorrow would test everything she'd learned about leadership, survival, and the courage to stand before people who'd scorned her. Dawn broke clear and cold. Ruth packed her calculations, her grandmother's locket warm against her chest, and rode down the mountain trail toward a town that needed her whether they wanted to admit it or not. Timber Creek looked smaller than she remembered, its streets narrow and dusty between weathered buildings. But faces appeared in windows as she rode past, curious, desperate faces belonging to families who'd heard rumors of salvation coming from the fat girl they'd mocked. The town hall stood packed when Ruth entered. Her notebook clutched against her chest like armor. Every seat was filled. Men stood along the walls. Women clutched children close, their eyes wide with hope and desperation mixed in equal measure. Mayor Patterson called for quiet, his voice carrying new respect. Mrs. Morgan has agreed to help us organize food distribution for winter survival. She's worked out detailed plans. Ruth walked to the front, her boots echoing on wooden planks. 300 faces stared at her, some skeptical, others hopeful, all desperate enough to listen. I won't lie to you folks, Ruth began, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. What we're facing requires sacrifice from every family. No exceptions. She opened her notebook, revealing pages of precise calculations. Current food supplies, properly managed, can see us through winter, but only if we work together with perfect discipline. Mrs. Henderson raised her hand. What do you need us to do? Everything I tell you, exactly as I tell you, Ruth said firmly. Hunting schedules by territory, food preservation for every scrap of meat and vegetables, rationing that might seem harsh, but will keep your children alive. For 2 hours, Ruth explained her systematic approach. Hunting parties coordinated by district, community kitchens to eliminate waste, preservation techniques that would stretch supplies, rationing schedules calculated to the ounce. What if someone doesn't follow the rules? Asked Tom Bradley, skepticism clear in his voice. Ruth met his gaze directly. Then they can explain to their hungry neighbors why personal comfort mattered more than community survival. The vote was unanimous. Winter arrived early that year, but Ruth's system held firm. Hunting parties brought in steady supplies of game. Community kitchens served carefully portioned meals that satisfied without waste. Root cellars stayed organized according to her detailed charts. When the Henderson child fell sick with fever, Ruth adjusted rations to provide extra nutrition for recovery. When the Morrison family lost their food stores to fire, the community shared without question because the system had built trust. Not one family went hungry. Not one person starved. Spring came late, but it came to a town intact and grateful. The celebration feast filled the church hall with aromas Ruth had dreamed about through the lean months. Fresh bread, early vegetables from carefully tended gardens, preserved meat prepared according to her techniques. But more than food filled the room respect, gratitude, and the solid satisfaction of survival achieved through cooperation. Mayor Patterson stood to address the crowd, his voice carrying genuine emotion. "We gather tonight because Mrs. Ruth Morgan showed us how to save ourselves. Her wisdom and leadership guided us through the darkest winter in memory." Applause filled the hall, but Ruth barely heard it. She was watching faces, the same faces that had mocked her months ago, now showing gratitude and respect, earned through competence and character. "Mrs. Morgan," Patterson continued, "the town council unanimously requests that you accept the position of food manager, permanent appointment, with our sincere gratitude." Ruth stood slowly, feeling the weight of her grandmother's locket against her chest. Around her, 300 people waited for her response, people who'd learned to value substance over appearance, character over social standing. "I'm honored by your trust," Ruth said, her voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "And I accept, with one condition. We remember what we learned this winter. We take care of each other, always." The standing ovation shook the building's rafters. Later, as families dispersed to homes saved through cooperation, Ruth's mother approached with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "I was wrong about everything," she whispered. "Can you forgive a foolish old woman?" Ruth embraced her mother, feeling forgiveness flow between them like spring water. "We both learned something important this winter." "What's that? Worth isn't about what people see on the outside. It's about what you do when folks need you most." Ruth rode home through mountain twilight, her heart full of quiet satisfaction. The cabin glowed with welcoming lamplight, smoke rising straight up from the chimney in the still air. Elias waited on the porch, the rescued dog at his feet, both of them healed and strong. "How did it go?" he asked, helping her down from her horse. "Better than I hoped." Ruth leaned against his solid warmth. "They learned to see past appearances to what really matters." "And what's that?" Ruth smiled, touching her grandmother's locket. "Character, competence, the courage to stand up when people need you." They sat on the porch as stars emerged overhead, bright points of light in the clear mountain air. The dog dozed between them, content and peaceful. "What happens now?" Elias asked quietly. "Now we build something lasting. A partnership based on respect, not just need." Elias took her calloused hand in his own work-roughened fingers. "I choose you, Ruth, every day, for all the days we have." "And I choose you back," Ruth replied, her voice strong with certainty. "Partners in everything." The mountains stretched around them, vast and enduring, while night sounds began their familiar chorus. Ruth Morgan, no longer the unwanted girl, But a woman who'd found her worth through service and courage looked up at the stars and knew exactly who she was, and exactly where she belonged. Sometimes I wonder if we've forgotten what Ruth learned on that mountain, that true worth comes from character and what we do when others need us most. In our world of quick judgments and surface appearances, her story reminds us that the people we overlook might be the very ones who can save us. I've seen it in my own community, the quiet neighbor who organizes meal trains for sick families, the soft-spoken woman who runs the food bank with military precision, the person others dismiss who steps forward when crisis hits. Ruth's courage to serve those who had scorned her speaks to something deep in the human spirit. Her transformation wasn't magical, it was practical. She learned skills, developed competence, and chose service over bitterness. When her moment came, she was ready not because she was perfect, but because she'd prepared herself to be useful. Maybe that's what connecting communities really means, recognizing that everyone has something valuable to offer. If we're wise enough to look past appearances to character. Author's disclaimer. This story is a work of fiction inspired by themes of redemption and community service, created solely for entertainment purposes. The author does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters, events, and situations are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons, living or deceased, or actual events is purely coincidental. This tale celebrates personal growth, community cooperation, and finding dignity through service to others.